Welcome to the second session. So we have three very interesting speakers here again. We're going to start out with Dr. Jeffrey Becker, who is the principal research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis. And even if it's called naval analysis, that it's not the only thing they do. It's a very prominent think tank in the US that deals with everything. And Jeff has been dealing with Chinese foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, but also a lot on China in general. We're Mr. Gunnar Hökmark, who is the chairman of the Swedish think tank Stockholm Free World Forum. He's also one of the major voices behind Ukraine, and every Monday, if you have the time, please join Gunnar. He is holding a rally for Ukraine, have done so, and will continue so until it's clear. He's a former member of the European Parliament as well. And then we have Dr. Christina Wainikka. As an associate professor at civil law and policy, expert on intellectual property at the Swedish and Svenska Näringsliv. And so she will be bringing a bit of the business perspective here. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But Jeff, do you want to start?
Sure. Excellent. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to have a conversation. Maybe that's a little easier from a technology perspective. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, first, I'd just like to thank ISDP and the embassy for this opportunity to engage in what I think is a really increasingly critical topic for both the United States and our allies here in Europe, particularly Sweden, to include Sweden. I'd like to note before I begin that, as was mentioned, I work for the Center for Naval Analysis. We are a think tank in the United States. We're what's referred to as an FFRDC. We're a federally funded research and development center, which means that some of our research funding comes from the United States government, Department of Defense, but we are an independent organization. We are not part of the United States government. We are not part of the Department of Defense. So before I begin, I just want to note that my comments today, they're my own personal opinions. They don't represent the opinions of Center for Naval Analysis or the United States Navy or the US Department of Defense. But with that in mind, as we know, the topic talking about today, technological innovation, research security, the ability to continue to develop and to adopt new technologies, to mobilize those technologies, and to protect the fruits of that innovation. These are critical components of national power in the current international climate. And I think nowhere is this issue more important than in the transatlantic partnership between Europe and the United States, and the increasingly complicated, we talked about the complexity of the relationship in the previous panel, that the European Union and European partners in the United States have with the People's Republic of China. My own personal opinion, I think that since the 18th Party Congress in 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, I think we've seen this issue of technological security and China's efforts to acquire advanced technology from abroad. I think these have come to the forefront when we talk about economic relations with China. And to be clear, China has long sought to leverage its economic relationships and its economic power, its markets, to acquire advanced technology from overseas. This is not anything new, in my opinion, under Xi Jinping. And personally, I don't think this is anything unique to China. All countries seek to advance their country's technological assets, and they do so through engagement, through international trade and international relations. However, I do think there are some features of governance under Xi Jinping that have exacerbated this challenge for the United States and for Europe. And I think when we talk about, I will focus my comments today on the private sector in China, the private commercial companies and private enterprises. But I think many of the examples that I provide are applicable to research institutes in China as well. And I think what really, if there's one point that I'd like to make in my comments today, it's this issue that I think over the past 10 years, we've seen this space within China for operating as a private sector institute or as a private sector organization really start to diminish. And the amount of control and the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms used by the party state has really sort of expanded. And I think that's creating a challenge for actors in China to operate in the way that they have in the past. So I'll get into that a little bit. And the first point I'd like to make about changes that have exacerbated this issue of innovation security and technology security. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how the growing control of the Chinese party state and the Communist Party and the way in which it wields that control and that monitoring over the Chinese economy, how it's manifested itself in China's economic relationships and the relationships that private sector or commercial entities have globally. And then third, I'd just like to take a few moments and talk about some of the things, what can we do? By sort of we, I mean the partnership, the Transatlantic Partnership, and even partners in the Indo-Pacific, both governments and private sector or societal actors, which would be research institutes as well. So those are sort of three points I'd like to make in the comments I have today. So first, what has changed in China that makes this longstanding challenge to technology protection and innovation security? What makes this challenge so much more acute, in my opinion? Like I said, I think one could reasonably make an argument that China has long sought to acquire advanced technologies from the West through joint venture programs, which require foreign firms to disclose intellectual property we're all familiar with, or engaging in investments or acquisitions overseas to acquire that technology, or by attracting foreign experts to engage in collaborative research, which we heard about in the previous panel. And these types of activities are all continuing, they're all ongoing, and they've been ongoing for quite a while, and China's not the only country to use these types of activities to advance its technology sectors. But I think that under Xi Jinping, we've seen a growing recognition that the Chinese Communist Party has become much more ambitious and much more assertive in its relationships with private sector actors. And I think that we've seen that there's been an increase in the growing efforts to monitor private sector activities on behalf of the party to influence corporate governance, particularly. So previously under Hu Jintao, and before that under Jiang Zemin, we've seen record amounts of economic growth under China. However, the Chinese Communist Party's presence in the private sector at that time was quite limited. And when Xi Jinping came to power, he considered this to be a significant crisis for the Communist Party's continued rule in China. And over the past decade, we've seen the CCP set about trying to rectify this situation. It's bolstered its presence and its authority within both state-owned enterprises and the private sector, and indeed within a large number of different societal groups. The Communist Party saw that under Hu Jintao, that the atrophy of its position within Chinese society was a real issue. If it was going to continue to be the sole sort of politically legitimate entity within China, it really needed to reestablish its position within society. And it sought to do that, and it's been successful, in my opinion. And just to give you some examples from the private commercial sector within China, by 2017, about 3/4 of all private firms had established a party cell within China. And that includes the nation's 500 largest private firms. In 2018, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, so this is the government body which oversees listed Chinese firms on the Chinese stock markets. They passed the revised Code of Corporate Governance. And this requires all Chinese firms, regardless of ownership type, so this would include state-owned enterprises, private firms, what have you, to support party building activities if they're listed on a Chinese stock exchange. And so once the Chinese Communist Party sought to establish its presence within the private sector, and once that presence was reestablished, it began to elevate the party's role in corporate decision-making. So hundreds of private firms now, they've amended their articles of association, which give the CCP organization within the private firm a formal corporate governance authority and some role in decision-making, be it on the board or be it through some other corporate governance activity. The party has also dispatched firms from the provincial level or the central level to serve in leadership roles in private firms. And we've seen this in the automotive giant Geely, who's obviously has a huge position in Sweden, as well as the tech firm Alibaba. So the party has been able to position itself in such a way as to improve its ability to monitor the activities of private firms and to influence decision-making. And so it sought to reestablish that position it had in the past in society, and then allow a situation to take place so that the CCP has some level of governance and authority within those private firms and within society more broadly. So another factor we've seen is the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to break down this distinction between the state and the private sector altogether. So the Chinese government has encouraged joint ventures between Chinese SOEs and between private firms. So we've seen mixed ownership investments in which Chinese state-owned enterprises and state-financed investment entities, they acquire a stake in private companies. And then in return, we see private companies under the direction of the state, they take investment positions within state firms. And this makes it much more difficult to identify what we would truly call a private firm, a private commercial entity that is not somehow connected to a state-owned entity or to the central government or the provincial governments, for example. So just to give you some examples of this, in 2000, private firms in China that received investments from state-owned enterprises that were heavily reliant on state capital, this was about, say, 16% of all registered capital in China. But by 2019, this had more than doubled to about 35% of all registered capital. Moreover, private firms in which the state have invested directly, they're now responsible for about half of all private assets in China today. So you have an increasingly close financial connection between the state and the private sector, which provides yet another source of leverage over private firms. And it facilitates the convergence of interest between the CCP and the private sector. So this is really, in my view, it's very much about sort of trying to mitigate your traditional principal agent issues. When you have the Communist Party as the sole political entity within China, trying to monitor and understand what's going on within the large country that it is overseeing, it has a principal agent problem. And it's taken a number of steps over the past decade to sort of mitigate these principal agent issues and trying to identify and move forward with ways in which you can connect the interests of both the state and the market forces. That's one way of doing this. We've seen examples where these investment relationships between the state and private sectors, they serve as a conduit for the Chinese state to acquire advanced technology. And I think we're all familiar, for example, in 2015, the Chinese private firm Navtech acquired Silex, the Silex Microsystems, with the support of the PRC State Semiconductor Fund. Meanwhile, at the same time, Navtech's parent firm, Beijing Nawei Times Technology, this was a firm that received multiple certifications from the government, the PRC government, to conduct research and development and conduct production and procurement on behalf of the Chinese military. So what we see is a good example when we talk about innovation security and technology security of the ways in which these connections between the state and market commercial entities within China facilitate this sort of two-stage technology acquisition process, where we have technology acquisition on the part of the private sector and in turn from the private sector to the state. And the state's effort to break down these barriers between the state sector and the economy is helping to facilitate this transfer process, in my opinion. And then a third way, which we alluded to on the earlier panel about this expanded authority, is simply through increased state laws and regulations. And I think we're all relatively familiar with some of the more recent ones. Article 7 in the 2017 National Intelligence Law, for example, now obligates firms to quote unquote support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts. And interpretation is always difficult when talking about Chinese law, but some have interpreted this as requiring firms in China to assist the state in conducting national intelligence work. We have other laws like the 2023 amendments to the PRC counter-espionage law, which now provide a legal basis to compel private firms in China to share sensitive data. And then you have other earlier laws like the 2016 National Defense Transportation Law, which require private firms to support military actions in the protection of Chinese overseas interests. And we've seen Chinese shipping and Chinese logistics firms operating and exercising with the Chinese military in order to make sure that they're ready to accommodate. So in short, although the PRC has long sought to use its economic resources to advance its interests, I think what's new in the situation that we face today is there's a new situation in which the PRC has both the economic resources that it's long had at its disposal, but it also has a level of authority and control over those resources that I think it's really worked towards over the past decade. And I think this is what is somewhat new, a new environment that we're facing. So the second point that I want to address is to briefly note how this expanded control and this authority has affected Chinese private firms operating abroad. And I think the challenge for Chinese private firms, both in China and those that are operating globally, is that they now are in a much more difficult situation where I believe it's difficult for them to maintain independence and separation from the Chinese state. And I don't think it's surprising that we've seen some controversy surrounding some of the private firms that we've been discussing. So just to provide a few examples, in October of last year, we know Alibaba was accused by the Belgian government for potentially using its logistics operations in that country to conduct espionage on behalf of Beijing. A few months later in December, US senators accused the giant EV battery maker, the contemporary Amperex technology, CATL, of posing an espionage threat to military bases within the United States. And I think that company, the large private firm CATL, that poses an interesting case, given its growing footprint here in Europe. It's recently finalized a deal to establish a $7.6 billion EV battery plant in Hungary, one of its China's sort of closest allies in Europe. And I think from a political perspective, Hungary has been a close ally of China. And as an EU and NATO member, it serves as a useful conduit through which the PRC can exert its influence. So I do see that there's some significant commercial potential for things like that. It provides an inroad for the European markets that may mitigate market access challenges in the future, but it also serves as sort of a countervailing balance or another sort of political issue or political support, political objective as well. So I think that's a good example how you see sort of a convergence between private sector interests and the interests of the state. And some of the examples of the way in which the CCP has expanded its authority over the private sector that I just provided, those apply to CATL as well. So in 2022, the company modified its own articles of association to include party building as a core effort of that company. It's developed ties to national defense research institutes that work closely with the Chinese military. And it's also established joint ventures with state-owned firms that produce PLA weapon systems. It receives tremendous amounts of state support. I think in the first half of 2023 alone, it received almost $400 million worth of state support, which I believe is the most of any A-share listed company in China. So the party state, by expanding its role and its decision-making authority within private firms, it's by modifying its financial incentive structures and then breaking down this distinction between what is a state and what's a private entity. The CCP has created an environment that facilitates the mobilization of private firms to act on behalf of the state. And just some clarity, I don't say this to suggest that PRC firms don't have financial interests. I think CATL's investments in Hungary and its investments in natural resources overseas, I think is a great example. And I don't think that private Chinese firms operate simply as an arm of the state. I think that's too reductionist. But I think it does indicate that the party state in China has taken steps to improve its ability to sort of monitor the activities of private firms, particularly those that operate in advanced technology that the state prioritizes, and it's able to mobilize those entities on behalf of the state if it's needed to do so. And so that brings me to my third point is, given this new situation in which the Chinese government now has the economic resources and has reasserted itself in the economy to such an extent, given this new environment, how does Europe and the United States or partners in the Indo-Pacific, how do you respond to this changing environment? And I think this is the challenge. This is why we're having this discussion today. And I think the discussion today will help to generate some ideas. But any successful policy approach, in my opinion, has to have at least sort of two fundamental components. One is that it's important to make difficult choices and to define clearly what types of technologies merit protection and what types do not. I think we talked about that in the previous panel, is that it's important to understand where the boundaries are going to be, because simply cutting off all connection, economic or science and research between China and the United States is neither, or Europe and European allies, it's neither practical nor advisable. But at the same time, China's vastly different today than it was 15 to 20 years ago in terms of the security threats that it poses. So clearly some level of technology protection is warranted. And so I think the level of protection that needs to be considered in this larger context, I think that has to be part of the conversation, and that has to be an open and transparent discussion to understand what that specific technology protection regime is going to look like. And I think the second important component of this is the importance of information sharing and coordination between the transatlantic partners. So partners on both sides of the Atlantic are going to continue to evaluate levels of acceptable risk in technology protection. And I think they need to do so in collaboration. And I think they have to have an open and constant discussion about what types of technology merit protection and which do not, on one hand. And on the other hand, I think it's also very important and helpful to share information in terms of what we're seeing with regard to trends in PRC technology acquisition efforts and the ways in which certain entities seek to acquire technology overseas. And so I think that those two components, the information sharing and the constant collaboration, those form a foundation of how to really get at this issue of an effective technology protection regime that can sort of mitigate some of these risks without taking it too far to an extreme. And I'll probably gone on too long. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Gunnar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the ISTP for forcing me to think about those issues. I always feel uncomfortable sitting among experts on an issue that I'm not an expert on. So I'm quite nervous. But I have a solution to that, because what I then do is I try to give my picture on those things. And no one else is more expert on that than I am. So that's my take. First of all, I think what we are talking about are in some way squaring the circle. We are eager to have openness, and then we see there are consequences of this openness. So we want to be closed as well. And that's a difficult operation. And I think it requires a lot of analysis, differing between what is important and what is less important, but also how you create gravitation in the global economy that is to our advantage. The second thing is, just to have it said, let's be very clear about China or PRC. PRC will be a hostile actor to democracy and freedom for foreseeable time. And, surprise, surprise, it has been as well. This is nothing new. And that is because it is run by the logic of a dictatorship. Democracy and freedom is a threat to every dictatorship. And I don't need to elaborate more on that here, but I mean, it's quite interesting how fearful they were against the protests in Hong Kong. Students demonstrating for something. And this very, very big economy, this very big dictatorship was so fearful. It doesn't even dare to talk about what happened in its own history regarding demonstrations, etc. So let's have that in mind as well. And the third thing that I would like to underline, that it has come through here, but in some way, I think we need to think about it a little bit more. And this seems very brutal or simplifying, but let's not forget, we are better. Our societies are better. And sometimes we tend to forget that when we discuss on those issues. And that is not only because we are hailing democracy, etc., but an open society is much, much better to foster new ideas, new technologies, new innovations, besides the fact that we are happy and can listen to better music and eat better food and meet the people we would like to meet. But we are better also in these more direct political consequences of how you foster growth and new ideas. We're maybe not making full use of it. And that's, I think, the thing we need to do in order to square the circle here. We need to be better in this new world to understand it. And let me just, sitting here, for you who are foreign guests here, we are sitting here along Skeppsbron. And this was the gateway, the Sweden's gateway to the world for centuries. Because from here it was exported, was Sweden exported. It was minerals, iron and copper, coming from the mines in Bergslagen in other parts of Sweden. And it was fur and timber coming from the forests. And it was shipped out to Nyen, that is the old name for St. Petersburg, when it was a Swedish city. I'm just telling Mr. Putin that this is a Swedish city. It was a very cosmopolitan city because they were talking Russian, German, Swedish, Finnish, and probably some other language as well. It was rather cosmopolitic, and to Riga, and to Newcastle, and to Hull, and to Hamburg and Bremen. And that was the world. I mean, this was before US entered the global scene. That was the world, a little bit more, but it was in some way enough. But the logic was also that all the factors of production was stable and rooted on the territory. The forests and the mines were where they were. And in some way, we have lived in an economy that has been a prolongation for that for quite a long time. And as a lot of experts here, they are maybe going to discuss what I'm saying, but I would say that the last 30 years have been the first phasing out from this logic, where knowledge and services have been replacing the mines and the factories. And this is a change that has extreme geopolitical importance and impact, because when we had the main strategic production structures and assets on the territory, they were there, they didn't move. But in the modern economy, as we have seen more and more in the last 30 years, this is changing because knowledge and intelligence and qualified systems are extremely movable, and which we see. Ideas and information, they are spreading within the millisecond. And this means that, and that is a paradox, and we all know that in this much bigger world, the distances are quite shorter, or they don't even exist. And this means also that, if I phrase it brutally, the enemy is here. If we're talking about the enemies, they don't even need to invade a country in order to get hold of the mines. They can use it by more subtle ways of dealing with it. So I think we need to understand that the logic of this modern economy, and that will be increasing the coming 30 years, of course. That will be that everything is movable and flexible. And to the Swedes here, some of the Swedes here did see a very popular children's program for I think it was maybe 30 years ago. It was 4 milos. 5 ants are more than 4 elephants. And then they explained the difference between here and there. Here is where you are, and there is where you not are. That is now faded away, because here is there and where we are everywhere. This is an important understanding as well about the logic, because this means that we need to safeguard our own structures at home, and we can't rely on the distances. The more digital, the less territorial, so to say. So what to be doing about this? Well, first of all, I think that we have to understand that we are not, the problem is not that China and others are developing. That is in a bigger sense, that's quite good. I mean, the development of the global economy in the last 30 years has defeated poverty as a phenomenon, and more people are living in relative prosperity than ever. 30 years ago, it was 1 billion people doing it. Today, it is 5 out of 6 billion people, or 7 maybe. It's 1 billion left, so to say, that is not living in relative prosperity. That's a fantastic development. The problem is not that they are doing good. The problem is that we are not doing better. And that is in some way the challenge we need to understand. But in order to deal with that, I think we need also to understand another thing that has been neglected the last 30 years in this very rapid change. And that is that free trade is something you have. In reality, you have free trade only with free societies. Otherwise, it's not free trade. It's open trade or whatever. Well, you are scientists here, all of you, so you can do the job. Find a better name. And I want us to have a trade with all others, because we need to relate to entities like PRC and to all others. So we need to do that. But it is not free. And I think we have been naive about that, because we have brought our logic to them, so to say, and thought they would behave like we do, and they don't. So that's one thing that we need to understand. And then I think we need to understand or see that we are eager to defend the openness of the global economy. And that will require a lot of things. We need to understand the importance of the globalization, as I mentioned. But then in this perspective, we also need to see what has happened during these 30 years. And if I take a time perspective, I was very active in the negotiations in European Parliament, in the negotiations between European Union and United States about the deepened trade and investment partnership. And at that time, 2011, and this is to me, quite interesting figures. The relations between the GDP of our different entities was that European Union had $16+ trillion as GDP. US had $16 trillion as GDP. So the European Union was slightly bigger, also according to CIA figures, I would like to underline. And China had $8 trillion, and Russia $2 trillion, which is already then an economic dwarf in this global perspective. But that did also mean that US and European Union together were 4 times bigger than the Chinese economy. Quite good and quite important for all the aspects we're discussing now. Because being 4 times bigger is quite a leverage. And then we could add, of course, also Canada, Japan, South Korea, and some others. So, I mean, we could gang up quite good. But now, the fact is, or 2021, or now, I can use the figures now. Now the situation is that European Union is not equal with the US. We are equal with China, which is slightly bigger. We have $17 trillion something, and they have 17 plus trillion dollars. And US have, I think it is $23 trillion, which is making it, of course, the leader. But you see the dominance of the transatlantic economy is not the same. And Russia is something, I mean, now it's a wartime economy and it's doped, etc. So, but I would say it's $1.5 trillion. So it has decreased its importance. But the important fact is that we do not have the same impact on the global economy as we had at that time. And this means that we need to think about how to foster a climate for growth and leveraging the opportunities free societies have. And as you may have experienced, this is a time in Sweden of celebrating alliances. We are in Sweden celebrating the fact that we are now members of NATO. So now it's time to think of all the new alliances we need to have. And I think we should form a new alliance in order to deal with this. We can call it North Atlantic Science, Research and Intelligence Treaty. Well, we can work with abbreviation coming after that. But in order to foster common research programs, foster common joint science centers of different kinds, but also to foster that we are not entering into what is in Europe discussed as, especially among the French and some others, what is phrased European autonomy or European sovereignty. Because what we have seen regarding Ukraine and a lot of other things, and what we will see regarding China on the global scene, the US and European Union will and do need each other. And if we are not to deal with the Chinese in order to close them out, it will be dangerous, because then they will invent things that will become maybe more dangerous for us than if we can spread the knowledge. We need to be on before. We need to be the leaders. And in a world where science and research are distributed very rapidly, there is one thing that is not as easy to move, and that is clusters. And the clusters are based upon innovations. It's quite striking that the London city has for, I think, 800 years been a global center for finance. It's quite interesting that Taiwan is the global center for the production of semiconductors. It is not the science as such, it's the innovation and the opportunity to transform the innovation into a cluster where a lot of things are hanging together. So I will end here by launching the idea of, I think we can call it NASCA. That is the North Atlantic Science and Cooperation Alliance or something like that. Thank you very much.
Christina?
Yes, I see the presentation coming up. And as you heard, I'm from the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, Svenskt Näringsliv, as we say in Swedish. And for those of you not familiar with Svenskt Näringsliv, we consist of 60,000 member companies from all types of industry. And in November last year, we presented a report on globalization and intangible assets and intellectual property. And we were covering topics like the geopolitical tensions, and also that intellectual property is actually part of the battlefield when we talk about warfare. So this is really our kind of topic in that report. And one thing about that report is that, of course, we're quite happy about it, but I met a person in Brussels last week who said he really, really enjoyed the report and apparently had actually read the report. And then he said, I really enjoyed the report, but it was very Swedish. And why was it very Swedish? We can go to the next slide. Here you can see me. And I also wrote the report, and you can see I'm standing in front of Adam Smith's statue in Edinburgh. And I look quite happy.
And we can even see the invisible hand.
And that is the foundation, the starting point of the report, the importance of openness, the importance of collaboration, the importance of division of labor, and that creates wealth of nations, as his famous work was called. So our belief, which is covered in that report, is that Sweden is proof of that, and that a country like North Korea, for example, that is not that open, is also proof of his theories. So those are the foundations of that report. And for those of you who don't know me, I have a background as a legal researcher, so I've been researching intellectual property, but also rules on industrial espionage. And how that legal framework looks. And I will start, because the title covered both risks and opportunities, and I'm going to start with opportunities. Next slide, please. So this is a graph, and this is one of the reasons why I get up in the morning, because this is called the smile curve. And it's very often used to describe what has happened in the economy, just as you mentioned. And if we look at this, and there's a comparison with the smile curve in the 1970s and now the smile curve as it looks today. And on that scale, you have value creation, and on that scale, you have the value chain. And what we can see, and especially exactly like you described, Gunnar, is that what is linked to intellectual property is creating more and more value. So we have the research there, and we have the design, and on that side we have related services, and we have marketing where we have the trademark strategies and so on. So this is the proof that these things are becoming more and more important to businesses, but also to countries. Next slide, please. But there are some complexities that we have to deal with. And one complexity is actually the view on innovation. And of course, innovation is really important, and that is sort of what we do with the research results. And we often have a view, especially from policy perspective, that innovation is something quite isolated. And sort of it's the dynamite or or a lighthouse or something that can be isolated. But innovation is so much more complex today. And one example, there is a political debate now in the EU regarding standard essential patents. And linked to that, I'm not going to go into that debate, but about a year ago, news came out on an agreement of standard essential patents between Ericsson and Apple. And the worth of that agreement is 1.6 billion Swedish crowns, not for the duration of the agreement, not per year, but per quarter. That means quite a lot of money. And that technology is when Apple is using Ericsson technology. And we don't see that. So we buy an iPhone and we look at the iPhone and we don't see the complexity of the intellectual property that is behind it. And we need to understand that complexity and those dynamics. The second one is about the global value chains. And almost all companies are part of global value chains. When we wrote the report, I had a discussion with some colleagues and they thought I was exaggerating. And they said, but if you go and buy a pizza on Friday night, is that pizza parlor really part of a global value chain? Of course they are. Where does the oven come from? The pineapple that some people put on the pizza and so on. So even the smallest type of business is part of a global value chain, which is, of course, is good because we want that collaboration and wealth of nations and so on. But, and here comes the lawyer part. Principle of territoriality is a foundation in law and especially when it comes to intellectual property. So each country has their own legislation. So in Sweden, we have Swedish patent law, and in Germany, they have German patent law and copyright law and so on. And for many intellectual properties, we don't even have a single market. We don't even have a single market where we have the same legislation on intellectual property. So even if you isolate your value chain to just EU, you will still have to deal with the principle of territoriality. Not very prosperous, I would say. And then we also have changes that we have to adopt to. And those are, of course, we have the geopolitical tensions and developments and so on that can be quite complex. And I can imagine my family name being quite difficult to pronounce, but if you look at a map on Finland, if you were able to still take a train from Helsinki to Moscow, the last train station on the Finnish side is Wainikka, and the ending la means place. That's Wainikka's place. So geopolitical tensions sort of in the family, and we see those developments. And there, of course, we have to handle them. But what we also have to handle is our self-image. Often when we talk about intellectual property in China, we talk about the counterfeiting, the piracy, and we talk about them stealing our inventions and so on. But in fact, we should also be concerned with them being better at innovation themselves. If we look at international patent applications, we normally would have imagined US and Europe being top. We're not in international patent applications. China is number one, and they passed the USA some years ago. That is a problem. Some 10, 15 years ago, Europe had 3 countries in top 5 of international patent applications. Now there are 3 Asian countries in top 5 and only Germany left. We have to deal with that self-image, and we have to address it. And those developments happen not only in those relations. I actually read, and this might come to us as a surprise, Botswana in Africa, they have a national IP strategy. And their strategy says that the economy of Botswana is to be IP driven by 2036. So we have to adopt, we have to perform better because we do have problems with that. Next slide. So what are the risks? One of the risks that we are having, and this is both European and Swedish perspective, is a lack of understanding what creates value. Sometimes when I show audiences the smile curve, they look surprised. It is news to them. They don't understand the importance of the intangible assets that creates value. And to give one example, in 2019, there was a seminar in Almedalen in Sweden. And Almedalen is like a political fair, whatever you can describe it as. And they were discussing Swedish universities as a candy store for foreign countries. So quite the topic that we are discussing here. And there was a person on stage in research that is interesting both from a national perspective and from industry perspective, saying, well, what if my research results end up in China by sort of theft? I want my research to be spread. And I was sitting there, oh, no, because that field of research is something that's typically funded by industry. And the reason why the industry is funding it is probably because they want to apply for a patent. And having researchers standing on stage saying, ah, that means that I don't know if I want to call her stupid or naive, but something. So we need to make people understand that. And we actually have a very Swedish dilemma when it comes to this lack of understanding. The European Commission have done quite a lot of work in knowledge valorization. How do we create value from research results? And they've produced guidelines and recommendations, and these are actually quite good. So they could help with the understanding. The Swedish government looked into those recommendations, and they could have said to the universities, we demand that you look into these recommendations. We want you to read them and understand them. Instead, they said it's voluntary. And if someone comes with a recommendation that's quite difficult to understand, not what I'm really into reading, and says it's voluntary, will I do it? Not very likely. So that's a risk that we can see. Another thing is, of course, the lack of strategic decisions. So you don't really think ahead. So where, for example, when it comes to patents, where are you going to apply for a patent? When are you going to apply for the patent? Which rules apply? And so on, because there are differences in patent legislation. Digital innovations are easier to protect in the US, for example, and in Europe we have a very strict novelty requirement that you have to consider and so on. So if we don't think ahead, we might end up in troubles. And then we have the lack of analysis. And I understand that lawyers are not everyone's favorite kind of people. People often wait to talk to lawyers, but that is really harmful because we have insights into the legislation. So this thing about the principle of territoriality and so on, that's our field of expert. And just to give some examples, in Sweden, the Swedish universities apply to a rule called the principle of openness, which not only is a legal principle, but also creates a culture of openness. That might be difficult to handle. We have a principle on teachers' exemption when it comes to research results. And that has a tendency to lead universities to say, you're on your own. So if a researcher comes to lawyers at university and say, teacher's exemption, you're on your own, which is quite harmful. We have a trade secrets protection in Sweden that is like a very good Swiss cheese. That means it's full of holes, which is a problem. And at EU level, we also have quite a lot of legislation coming out undermining trade secrets protection in Europe. There was a voting in European Parliament yesterday on compulsory licensing, which we're quite worried about, because not only that you're going to be forced to make others use your patents in ways that are not that good, but also share trade secrets. And it's one thing to say that this license lasts this period of time because you could stop use the patent of invention. But how do you put a trade secret back in the box if you're sharing information? And that's legislation coming out now. We also have legislation coming out now on digital product passports. Very good, part of the Green Deal to facilitate recycling. But as a member company said, well, that's really good. Then the Chinese won't have to spend money on industrial espionage. Just read the digital product passport on every product. And that is what I would say, lack of analysis, lack of having this umbrella overview of the complexities that are there. Next slide, please. So back to Adam Smith. Isolation is not good. We need to collaborate, we need to discuss, we need to work across borders. But we also have to understand that collaboration is like dancing. And as you might see, I'm quite fond of Duolingo. And if you're going to dance with someone and they come from different realities, and that is true even if we have collaboration between industry and academia within Sweden, you would have to be able to discuss what dance are we dancing? Are we going to dance tango under this set of rules? Or are we going to dance something else? Because if we don't discuss it, we will be stepping on each other's toes and make each other angry, even though we didn't have to. So dancing tango is important. Thank you.
Well, actually, I can actually start with the Tansia tango, but because it came up with the Transatlantic Collaboration, the importance, and how big the joint economies are, as well as how much innovation it did. But I just finished a work on the supply chain thing and trying to build on the transatlantic supply chain. The reality is there's more regulation between the United States and Europe than it is between China and Europe. So it's there's much less regulated market, which of course opens up for collaboration with China and prevents you from entering the United States and vice versa. So it's easier to dance tango with the Chinese than it is with the United States. So my question is really, and that goes back to intellectual property and research and collaboration. And I don't know this answer, so I'm thrilled. I know how it works on the business side, but how does it work on research and innovation and all this? Is it easier? Do we need more deregulation? How do you improve the climate to actually ensure that the transatlantic link is utilized in a much more effective way? And I don't know the answer here, so should we start with the dancing?
The dancing tango. And I would think that the thing is, when we don't have rules or regulation, that means that we leave it up to the parties. And then the parties will have to be able to do it. So that to some extent makes it more difficult. But I do think we do need to collaborate more. And I also think that when we are collaborating with the US, we need to be not naive, but understanding where we come from and where they come from, and actually start to discuss it. And I think that is a key. Because if we meet people and we come with our naive attitude and talk to someone who's done the training, then they're just going to say no. If they do a due diligence, they're not going to be interested to collaborating with the Swedish university or even the European university, because it's a problem.
So what? The US is dancing foxtrot and we dancing tango. Basically.
Yes. No.
But I do, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that still Europe has its most important trade partner in US and vice versa. It is still there. And I think the answer to your reflection about regulations in different ways hindering is that we need to break up this. And sometimes things are broken up in politics when people understand that it's a necessity. And I think the reason why well, there is lack of understanding so far is that there still exists a naive approach and attitude versus China. And we have come into some sort of discussion. Some people discuss either we have it or not decouple China. And both of these strategies are too binary. We need to balance it. We need to have some sort of containment for those things that are dangerous, but also creating a strength for us. So they need to gravitate versus us and follow the rules in the global economy that are developed by our economies. And it lies in that we need to be better on science, of course, but also I think free societies will in the end always be the best on how to deal with innovations, because that creates a structure and pattern of clusters which are mainly done in free societies. It will come to why not, if you start to think about things, then you're suddenly moving towards it. Why not have a common system for intellectual property? Why not have and develop the legal system for dealing with this? Why don't we? NATO will, I think, on the next coming meeting, decide on having 3% as a level for defense spending. Why don't in my NASCA have a level of financing science with 5%? Because then we are elevating our economies, and then we are creating the leadership that makes us less vulnerable for those who are trying to undermine us or to weaken us. So let's think about how to go forward rather than how to relate. And one of the worst things we need to deal with is as I see it, the increasing protectionism in the US and the increasing protectionism of some other kind in European Union. I mentioned the strategic discussion about strategic autonomy and sovereignty, but also, for example, there is hostility among some people against the 4 or 5 big tech. I think we should be happy that Apple and Microsoft has been in Europe, because that has developed our digital development, and you should be happy about Ericsson and Nokia, by the way. So I mean, we need to see this as an approach where we can help build the advantages and the excellence.
Jeff, you had first, and then we'll.
Well, I think you identified a really important issue, which is that sort of the increased regulation that you just mentioned. It points to the fact that your incentive structures are misaligned to what, from a strategic perspective, you want to accomplish. And so hopefully what we can do is help to establish a system. I like the way, the administration talks about sort of investing, aligning, and competing. And I think I'm optimistic that the idea about aligning the incentive structures and the market coordination mechanisms and the regulatory environments in such a way that like-minded partners like the European Union, the United States, and others in the Indo-Pacific can help to trade and invest and cooperate from an economic perspective more closely in a way that bolsters the current international economic governance structure. Because doing so, helping to improve upon it, decreases the chance of other countries being able to erode that system. And then once that system is eroded, then that's when countries are able to take advantage of the increased regulation or the increased opportunities to do so. I think the challenge, I mean, I don't think it's, as I said, I don't think it's practical to completely decouple or disentangle the economic relationships that either the United States or the EU have with China. But the challenge, though, is I think you're now dealing with entities within China, be they societal entities and research institutes or commercial entities, private sector businesses. They're now operating in a restrictive environment in which they don't have the institutional independence and the protection of a legal regime that we take for granted in that international that free market system. And at the same time, you have a party state that has made the creation of a strong China, a technologically advanced China. It's at the forefront of the goals and objectives of the Chinese state. And to do so, the state will mobilize all aspects, all resources available to it, to include those research institutes, to include those private sector entities. And so that creates a challenging environment in which Europe, the United States has to operate. And it would be easy to say, fine, there will be no more interaction with PRC entities, but that's not practical. It would be what's the phrase? The medicine would be worse than the disease, so to speak. But what you can do is if you bolster that environment, that legal and regulatory environment, that puts the onus upon Chinese entities to operate according to those regimes, according to those rules, then that helps to mitigate some of the challenges. It's not going to resolve all the issues, but it does help to mitigate some of the issues that are at play, I think.
Christina?
Yes, I had some comments. One of the things is that if you are going to have collaboration, there must be trust. So we have to be reliable partners so that people trust us, because otherwise no one's going to collaborate with us. And we also have to have something to bring to the table. Just being someone being there is not good enough. We have to have something to bring to the table. And then another thing from a legal perspective is how EU is handling international developments. And one development is that we have a lot of legislation coming out handling American and Chinese tech giants. They are addressed as problems. And I can understand that from one perspective, but the perspective that is being missed is, why don't we have them? Why don't they develop here? And that is not being discussed almost at all. And actually, from my perspective, one of the reasons is the fragmentized legal development in Europe, including when it comes to intellectual property. And then one last comment, and that is a problem we have in some countries and some parts of the world, and that is the political handling of these types of issues. So one thing with China that I sometimes mention, and people say that you can't use China as a good example, but I will. What they did understand already many years ago was the link between innovation, prosperity, and intellectual property. So they developed a strategy, and they worked alongside that strategy. So how do we do things in Europe? If for those of you reading Swedish, probably this week there will be a text published on a web site called Smedjan on the political handling on special intellectual property, because even that is fragmentized. So for Sweden, for example, if I want to discuss intellectual property in relation to research, I have to go to the Ministry of Education. But if that research result is going to become a business, then I would have to go to another ministry and so on. And if I have something to discuss about the legal framework, then I would have to go to the Ministry of Justice. And that is not a very good way to handle this. So I talk to at national level to at least 7 or 8 different ministries. I do the same when traveling to Brussels. It's DG Research and Innovation and DG Grow and DG Trade and DG Connect. I'm very good at walking between those political entities, but that makes it difficult to create that reliable path.
No, I think it is pointing to, I mean, it's sort of, it's easy to put the blame on somebody else, but I think we have a lot to learn as well. I mean, and actually another example where the Chinese have done extremely well is actually innovation.
Yeah.
They deregulated and they made it very easy to get access to funding. Quite large sum of the focus on that, and that has actually kicked in. For us, it is extremely difficult. It is. So I think we need to of course, we protect, but also maybe think in terms of how do we manage internal.
And maybe if I may add one reflection here.
Sure.
And that is that a lot of the problems we are discussing now will be much lesser problems if we are the ones leading and they are coming after us instead of us feeling that we are number two. Because if we are leading, you can set the rules and you can set the patterns and the standards, etc. But also, then you are the ones that doesn't need so very much to cooperate. It's better that they need it because then they need to relate to the rules. And I think, and it has been mentioned, so that is nothing new. The best alternative to decoupling shouldn't be closing down, but de-risking, securing that we do trade with a lot of more entities all over the world, and we're relying on a broader scale. And I think that is what should be done. And by the way, the American and British agreement with Australia and New Zealand was AUKUS, but it has also another leg, that's the technology cooperation. So that's a pattern for what I'm saying about this transatlantic structure. It could be called AUKUS as well.
Well, thank you very much. We're gonna have a short break. I'm gonna open up for questions from the audience, and we're gonna have all the 6 speakers prepared to answer all your difficult questions. But I think it's important that we bring up this, that we need to ensure that we have actually, I think Rebecca's sort of circle there is really good, that you have that sort of nucleus that protects against external, but what we do internally needs also to be looked at. So it never needs an answer. That's why we get paid. So 5 minutes break, and we have to be leaving 1:15. So I'm gonna open up. I'm not gonna try to summarize or ask my own questions, but I'd rather turn to the audience and see if anyone of you have any questions, or else I also have from the audience online, but anyone who would like to pose a question? And please identify yourself.
Yeah, Jing Dongyuan, Director of China Asia Program at Stockholm Enriching Research Institute. Very excellent presentation. I don't know even where to begin. Maybe I will pose one question about implementation. Because we have recently done a paper on de-risking. So we realized, just like the research security field, so the government can come in or issue regulations. And then there's the question of policy compliance. But for private enterprises, for university research labs, and research community, they have built up the connection over the years. And suddenly they have to change gear, change speed, and then without, many times being compensated for the sudden disconnect. So that's one question, how you implement force policy. In the EU, of course, it's not just EU-wide, EU member states. So they have their own kind of national priority interest. So that's one question. The second, I think, is related to many of your discussion that you talk about the concerns, with regard to doing research collaboration with China. So that immediately backs the question raised issue, why China? So there must be something, intellectual power, financial support that China can offer, which whatever the countries here in the US, European Union, either the government have not been providing funding over the years, because that the charts says a lot, the 1990s and 2022. So I mean, that explains certainly from China, the government support, investment, But then there's, in relative terms, there's not sufficient investment here. So I agree with the comment, it's not, we should stop doing good and we should be doing better. So these two kind of related questions.
Anyone who wants to start?
I can start, and this is going to be a story about old times milkmaids. But hear me out. They often sat on a three-legged stool. Do you know what I mean? That has three legs. And I think it's the same thing with implementation, actually, when it comes to protection of these types of assets. And so you really have to have all those three things in places, because otherwise it will fall. So those three legs is, of course, security and safety measures. So if you have a house, you lock the door. If it's an IT system, you have cybersecurity measures taken and so on. So that's one leg that needs to be implemented. And then the second leg is that you need to have good legislation in place that matches up with what you desire. So you have to have that legislation that is the one that's actually needed in the current situation. And then the third one, that is perhaps the most difficult one, and that's the soft things, the people, the understanding of the people. I had a student some years ago who was doing his master's paper on protection of business secrets in China for Swedish companies operating in China. And he went to China and interviewed Swedish companies there on measures that they are taking and so on. And we had written, questions, so we had, templates for questions. And when he came back home, he said that all of the questions we had prepared together, they were more or less useless because we didn't understand. And one of the measures that the Swedish companies had taken in China was that they were building houses for their employees. That was an important measure to protect business secrets. And perhaps it's some years ago, I'm not sure it would work now, but you have to also think about the people that are going to be part of how do we create their loyalty, how do we create their understanding, and so on. And back to the milkmaid, the thing is that you won't achieve anything if you don't have all three legs. Remove one leg, bad legislation, it will fall. And not thinking of the soft part about the people, it will fall. And so on. So you will have to consider all three different parts. Otherwise, you won't create implementation.
Anyone else?
I mean, to comment on your second question first, why China? I mean, I think for decades, there were a number of incentives, both for commercial businesses, obviously the access to such a large market, for research institutes, access to, tremendous amounts of research investment. So I think that some of those incentives have changed over the years. Some of those are still very much in play, which I think your first question pointed to about many of the research institutes that we're referring to, there are that close collaboration, financial and research, a number of different ways in which they collaborate. They're already in place and they've been in place for quite a while. So how do you mitigate, how do you change those patterns of behavior that have been established over the course of decades? And I think that is a challenge. And I mentioned I'm hoping sort of the approach that the US government is taking in terms of investing, aligning, and competing. I hope investment has to do with making available some of those funds that would help to replace some of the more problematic financial relationships. And then the alignment being helping to encourage the academic collaboration with like-minded partners. But I agree, that's a real challenge because this is a situation that's been in place for quite a while, and it's not something that's going to change overnight.
Implementation depends, of course, on what area or what issues we're dealing with. But I think that one thing that could and should be immediate is, of course, awareness. understanding with whom you are dealing. And I think if we just could come closer to that would help a lot. Swedish universities are today going through a process of establishing new security routines. But of course, if you see something, first awareness, but also second, if you see something that is destructive or dangerous, you should stop it immediately. Not think too much about it. And then, of course, there are a lot of other more complicated issues, guest researchers or guest students, etc. And I think that takes time in order to have a framework and understanding, but also that should depart from awareness. And so I think a revolution of awareness should be a good starting point.
Yes.
Yeah, also it's very important to have the universities on board in the implementation, and again to have this kind of aim to build this culture that we talked about.
You had a question there?
Yes, so I'm Tommy Schug. I'm a Lund University associate professor and also senior advisor at Stilt. And so this is more a comment rather than a question, but I'm kind of like addressing this kind of perspectives that we brought up here. And we're always talking about, I would call them parsimonious perspectives, because it's you kind of depart from this notion that this is a zero-sum game. So we're actually reacting to geopolitical adversaries, right? So if we don't win, you know, we're gonna lose, right? But while you, Christina, you've been talking more about, and Andreas also, actually been talking about before, this knowledge being an elastic resource. You know, it's how you use it. That's why it's so important to also invest in our own resources. And how does that look like? That's the other part, because if you look at the Swedish academia today, UKAS, with the Swedish Higher Education Authority, their numbers is basically 38% of our PhD students that graduate have a foreign background. Most of them from Poland, Iran, Russia, and China, right? So that's how our academy looks like today. And of course, when we are building relationships across, it is because they're reciprocal from certain perspectives, right? On average, you will not have a relationship if it's not reciprocal, right? So that's kind of like, so on the one hand, I'm going to have this kind of idea that this is a play between geopolitical adversaries. We do need to restrict, but then we go to that other picture where, you know, the pen we're working with is really open, you know, and it's also very international. So how are we going to restrict that with that perspective? I'm leading a research group. We should be looking, how do we actually somehow put these together, these views together? Because obviously there are a lot of conflicts. But instead of like digging our trenches and throwing, you know, grenades across each other over the field, we need to meet there and talk about, so if this is how academia looks like, and if that's how the game looks like today on the global level, how are we gonna actually somehow deal with that? That's really the issue. We're gonna need to find new ways of handling the rules of engagement in a globalization 2.0, right? Where globalization still occurs, it's just under different conditions.
I think you're touching upon a very interesting thing, and that is, do we actually discuss the right things?
Yeah.
And the issues that you're pointing to, we have seen them for decades. Many years ago, by the turn of the millennium, I was president of an organization for doctoral students, Sveriges doktorander, and we tried to discuss those issues, and no one wanted to discuss it with us. And we're still not really discussing what does that mean for academia. And then our perspective was also very narrow, because we had a lot of PhD students that couldn't teach, which meant that the Swedish PhD students had to teach more and fell behind on the research. So our perspective was very narrow, but we don't really discuss the right things. And then also the point that you made, we need to get out of the trenches. I think that's really important for all political issues that we do. Again, to Almedalen, what could you do in Almedalen? I actually, on a topic that's quite politically sensitive, we had a morning walk. Because if you have a morning walk, people can't take notes, and we can make sure that they were talking to other people than they normally talk to. And we do need to create more of those settings, I think, to actually start discussing the right things.
Eric?
Yeah, and I just comment on what Tommy was saying, and also I think maybe builds onto what you were saying, maybe a more sort of general point, but I think I agree, it seems to be two different logics working at the same time, sort of almost irreconcilable in some ways. But I'd like to think maybe, to go back to this general point, and also what you were saying, that, you know, we can, at least when looking at China, which I perhaps know best, is like, we can see it as an opportunity to rethink sort of central concepts like what science is and what democracy, etc. I think these concepts we take for granted, and we've taken it for granted for quite a while. And I think maybe we need to be more aware of what's the purpose of science, what is science to us, and begin that discussion earlier. And I think maybe, well, speaking from the research perspective, I think maybe these kinds of issues are something that you look at as some kind of extra thing that you think about when you sort of of your research project, or when you've written your paper or whatever, you start thinking about these issues, but you need to sort of have them integrated into your whole perspective, which could be, well, start talking with PhD students early on, integrating it into the whole education system.
I think we should differentiate the problem, because we're discussing all these things as it is one problem. I think there's a number of different problems. It's a difference between having collaboration between Chinese military, if I make an extreme, with the technological institute somewhere here in Sweden, or if you're having guest students or guest researchers, or maybe what role they play. I think that, I mean, one needs to be relaxed when we're discussing those things. I would like it that way, that Sweden do have a number of centers of excellence for research and science. And if you have that, they need to be international centers, because then what comes from that, people should go there. And I think it's much better that we have centers for science where people come to, than we need to go to other parts of the world or other centers. You see, I mean, in order to create the gravitation, you need to understand that it's a good thing to gather people. I think I'm not an expert on Silicon Valley, and I guess you know it much better. But of course, it's a cluster, and I think it's one of the success factors for the American economy. But there's a lot of people from China and India and other parts of the world there, and that is gathering their intelligence and knowledge in one center. And what comes from that is, of course, excellence, and that is in some way very rooted in the place. As I mentioned in my reflections, clusters tend to be much more rooted geographically than the knowledge and the information as such. So I think you need to differentiate the problem or the challenges, and then you need to go forward with a relaxed attitude.
I think your point reminds us about the challenge and the difficulty of the question at hand is how it would be much easier to resolve these types of issues if we weren't concerned about maintaining the ability to operate as a free and open collaborative society, which is one of the key values that we all do value. And so how do you maintain these, how do you protect what is important that merits protection in that type of environment, I think? And it reminds me of the phrase, like, where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit within sort of the broader environment. And as someone who focuses on national security concerns and issues, if Rebecca was here, she had a good example about cooperating and collaborating on issues like ecological diversity. Are there issues where the collaboration is a clear sort of joint win on both sides? Is that it's a value for both sides to collaborate? Things like infectious diseases or environmental issues. There are areas where, if we ask ourselves, if we collaborate in the creation of knowledge and both sides obtain this knowledge, does everyone benefit? I think the answer to that question is yes. And that's where I think collaboration should occur. But as Nicholas pointed out and others pointed out, there are issues. There are certain technologies to help advance the capabilities of the Chinese military to do things that are not in our interests, either the United States or, European countries, to increase the technological capacity to restrict and constrain and repress minority populations within China that are not aligned with the values that we have. And I think as challenging as that is, because this is the creation of knowledge is a fluid environment and system where it's very difficult to say, this is a concern and this is not a concern. The point is that, they very quickly come into a gray area. And that's the challenge of this question. But I think it's important enough that we do have to tackle, and we do have to engage with the question, is that there are some things that we can cooperate with, and there are some things that I think that it's just not in our interest to do so.
Yes, I just want to say that we need more of a strategic focus and thinking when it comes to international collaboration in general. And also, I think this kind of self-picture we have, and you mentioned with your smile curve that many people are surprised about that. And also I encountered quite often also that researchers in Sweden think that Sweden's production of knowledge is much bigger than what it is. If we look worldwide, it's a little bit less than 2%, which is pretty good for a small country like Sweden. But still, I hear that sometimes I get the comment that, wow, it's a bit more. So I think we need to have more of an updated view of ourselves and what the world looks like today. And here we talk about this transatlantic cooperation, but also we must understand that the center of gravity has moved very much to the Pacific. And we have to understand that. And I think we need so much more knowledge about what's going on in the world. And I mentioned earlier that our guidelines were cited or directly linked from New York Times, but in that article, it was also mentioned that before the pandemic, we had 11,000 American students studying in the in China, sorry. And then after the pandemic, it was 400. Then I got some updated numbers recently, that 700. I mean, this huge drop from 11,000 American students in China to 700. And the question is, who in the US, and I mean, I don't have the numbers from Sweden, but I think it would be something similar, but smaller numbers. But then who should understand other countries in the future if we are not having students studying abroad in these important regions of the world? And I think on Swedish side, it's really sad to see the dismantling of the offices for science and innovation at Swedish embassies. It used to be, I mean, if we go back before year 2000, it was, I think, up to 13 offices with some close to 100 people or so. And now it's 7 offices, but it's only like 5 innovation counselors in those countries. And we need much more of that to understand policy development in science and to better understand these issues from a Swedish context as well, because, or in American situation from American context, because that's very important, and we cannot necessarily rely on others to interpret the world for us.
Yeah, and it's just a very brief comment on that. That's I completely agree, and I think that's why I think for this example of students studying in China, I think you could look at it from different points of view. You can look at it as sort of the risk perspective and thinking, we can't have exchange programs with China, etc. It's just too problematic, etc. But we can also look at it as sort of an opportunity to, we're sending students to China, and they have this chance to learn about a society that's completely different and have completely different values. Well, okay, that's a good chance for us to rethink a little bit about our own values. We can integrate that into the sort of whole idea of this educational part. So I think you can look at it as an opportunity as well.
The short comments there are. Oh.
Well, also to strategic outlook, I think it's important also to look further down the line. I will see that in Asia and China that the population will be decreasing in coming years, and the population in Africa will go up and so on. So we also need to think strategically about who should we work with in the future. So beyond 2050, what is the world looking like that? And also have, again, much more strategic outlook. And when we talk about responsible internationalization, or as you frame it, research security, it has to be in a more generic form so that we are also prepared in working with other countries and situations that will come up there. For instance, now we see Swedish universities are very interested in collaborating with African countries, but of course we have a set of security policy issues and other topics that we need to address that. So we shouldn't be too narrow-minded, but have more a generic, broad outlook to deal with this kind of issues.
Excellent. One thing I do like is examples, and we run into a lot of negative examples. One question from the web from Brian Iceland is that given the strategic competition to technology and research, are there any good examples of effective academic and research institutions, framework and models to ensure collaboration with Chinese entities that do not compromise the technology aspect? And of course, yeah, but it would be good actually to stress those. And of course, the follow-up is going down the risk of the mitigation road. How will we know if such a framework are working? Because of course, the universities do not have their own counterintelligence capability. It's not that we have that. So could we be talking about closer coordination between research institutions and security agencies on screening and monitoring? So good examples, and how do we evaluate?
I think that's a really good point, especially the second point that he makes about how do you evaluate whatever framework you put into place to ensure that it's doing what it is you seek to acquire, you seek to achieve. Because it's difficult, and again, Rebecca would be able to speak to this more clearly, but I mean, it's difficult enough. The increased bureaucratic burden on academic research institutes to be able to put these sort of frameworks in place, but then to follow up to evaluate whether or not it's happening. I think it does necessitate sort of a more collaborative approach between the research institutes and the governments and even the private sector to be able to have a broader view about what are current trends and sort of the research environments in which they are occurring and how that's taking place. And I think in my mind, it would have to involve something more than just the universities themselves.
Maybe it sounds controversial, and I don't mean the whole of it, but I don't like frameworks because that's a way of escaping responsibility. It's a way of believing that you can solve it with a framework. It's the same as when company has ethical rules. They are already lost. In our company, many people. We don't steal and rob. You know what I mean? Yeah. It is in some way relying on the letters rather than the responsibility of the individual. And it is very open, not misused, but used as a way of escaping to take tough decisions. So I'm not against frameworks to go back one step, but you shouldn't rely on it too much. And I think has been forgotten in this discussion, but there is something that we call academic freedom. And I think as a researcher, you need to defend academic freedom. And if you defend academic freedom, you normally don't. We have the discussion in Sweden, how much shall state interfere with research and science? In the way the research and science shall take its way. And the same applies when we discuss collaboration. I don't think you need a framework in order to understand that you should not let a Chinese authority or Saudi Arabian authority create a framework or an agreement, a collaboration, where you have a research and science directed in one way or another, or where they have a steering competence. So in some way, a lot of those things are very complex and complicated, and you shall not believe anything else. But a lot of things are also quite simple, and I think we should also start with the simple things first. That's called low-hanging fruits.
Sure. A quick, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not in the piano, sorry, but I actually been working with these issues for some time, so I can probably provide a perspective on that. There are some red lines, so when they're drawn out, we need to relate to them very clearly, but most of it is very discretionary. And what works the best is actually transparency. We need to have transparency, who's working with who, and what are we actually doing, and to create some kind of level of transparency in the system. The problem with frameworks is that it will probably kind of like, especially if it encroaches on the discretionary responsibilities one have, then people will actually do it under the radar. That's the problem. So more things will occur when we're too strict. But reflexivity, so increased reflexivity, not only about personal goals, why you're working with someone, but also what are the institutional goals? What are national interests? And then you have to take that and looking at the other side also, what do they have that are personal goals, organizational goals, and national interests? And that's the reflexive process and transparency. Those are the underlying conditions to be able to work with it. If you don't do that, you're not going to be able to regulate everything. That's just not possible.
Johannes, you had a question?
Yes, so I'm Johannes Norden, junior researcher at ISTP. Dr. Becker, you mentioned in your discussion how it's neither practical nor advisable to just cut scientific ties. It is something that needs to be managed. So yesterday it was confirmed that the US-China Science and Technology Agreement was once again renewed for another 6 months, while the Biden administration tries to iron out the differences with Beijing. So I wondered if you had any insight into the main obstacles with this agreement, or what the standing frictions are.
When I made that comment, I was referring more to the broader economic relationship, and I don't think it's advisable to completely disentangle the two economies or to sort of decouple completely. I think that's true for intellectual cooperation as well. I don't have any specific insight into what the challenges are. I think that from my personal perspective, again, sort of just my own opinion, is I imagine some of the challenges have to be, at least from my perspective, where I sit is I see the increasingly restrictive environment in which these research institutes or commercial entities are being forced to operate. And I also see the incentive structure on the part of Beijing trying to make China into a strong technologically advanced country and being able to mobilize those resources within the state. And so that inherently creates an environment in which it's more difficult and more complicated to identify what are those types of areas in which we can engage in collaborative research that are going to be, as the Chinese refer to, win-win, right? That both sides will, if we do generate new knowledge and both sides have it, is everyone better off for that? And which types of intellectual investigation or collaboration would be detrimental to our interests. So I think again, it's only my own personal opinion, but I think that's a complex question to answer.
Any comments? Yeah.
I have a comment overall, linking also to the idea of strategies or frameworks. And I agree, sometimes they're just, something on paper and it doesn't really solve anything. But having a background also being part of, legal work, negotiating contracts. And that is extremely good, not only to actually achieve a contract and create a good situation, but you have the opportunity to discuss what's important to me. And especially when there are cultural differences. So let's say, for example, someone is talking to someone and say, I want a Christmas tree. And if you, in that negotiation on the contract, understand, what is a Christmas tree? Is it a birch? Or is it a pine? If that is not being discussed, someone is going to be very unhappy. And also, if you're not discussing on when is it supposed to be delivered. So even if you agree upon what a Christmas tree is, do you want it in January or do you want it in December? And I think the important thing of developing in your own strategies is that you think about what is important for us. And when you know what's important for you, then you can bring that to the other party and say, this is important to us. So that's why I actually do believe in having strategies and frameworks, especially having those discussions, because then you know what you're talking about. You can find potential conflicts.
Any more comments from the panel? Because we have 5 minutes left. So I'm terrified of well, I'm gonna give it to the lady.
And so a little bit of a longer question here, so I apologize for that. So we're talking about, and I know Mr. Tommy kind of mentioned it to the panel last time, I heard you talk about it, kind of this red line, and kind of like trying not to get there to like cutting off, you know, working with people from China and research and everything. But you know, when we talk about this civil military fusion, I think like the quote that was used in China was diplomatic personnel are people's liberation civilian clothing. And so kind of like to that note, in 1993, they kind of changed their active defense concept. And I think they said something along the lines of the future of warfare will be informationized and exchange of knowledge, which would blur the links between weapon systems and operational units through the use of information technology. And as a result, to these trends require militaries to transform accordingly. We're seeing that blur and that link between weapon systems and operational units. We're seeing this change in militaries where China is actively shifting this battlefield into like the civil arena. And kind of from what Mr. Becker was saying, it seems like, you know, these private institutions as well as the students, it's kind of like a draft kit. And, you know, yes, they're coming in and we're able to check off these boxes, you know, saying they have no, you know, links to the PLA and, you know, they have, you know, not any sort of like intricate connection to the CCP and they're not reporting to them. But at any point while they're here, they could easily, you know, get that order to start, you know, reporting back their research or what they're doing in the US back. And we don't know that, and that's kind of like we're not at the red line, but then they decide to kind of go under into that gray area that we're not seeing, and that's in the middle of them doing their research here. So my question is, you know, how can we continue promoting this international cooperation with this as open as possible and as closed as necessary environment when at any point technically these Chinese nationals who came over are turning into, you know, government workers because they were contacted by the government to start reporting back information.
Who wants to take that? I can only have one getting back on that.
I think your point is spot on about the Chinese recognition of, you know, refer to intelligentized warfare and the importance of advanced technology to future military capabilities. And so that is certainly something at the forefront of how Beijing thinks future conflicts will unfold. I think that your point about the party being able to you know, reach out and touch individual actors, be they commercial entities or individual researchers, I think does put those entities themselves in a difficult place. And that's what I was referring to as sort of the restrictive environment in which they operate. And I think it comes back to, from our perspective, you know, the transatlantic partnership, understanding, you know, where those spaces are, where collaborative knowledge generation can be beneficial for both sides and does not pose the risk, or if one does a cost benefit analysis, the rewards far outweigh the risks. And if that's the position, then collaboration should be fine. But there are, as you talked about red lines, I think there are areas where I think it's not in the expressed interest of either the United States or its partners in Europe to cooperate, simply because that generation of knowledge or new technology or benefits may accrue to entities that are taking action that are not in our interests.
Fantastic. So unfortunately, I'm gonna cut it here because we do have a tight deadline and there's a Prussian somewhere living inside me. So I'm sticking to the time, but it's been absolutely fantastic, and we have had 4 really interesting sessions around this topic, and 2 today and 2 last Monday. And I think it's, if nothing, it proves that we need more sessions, more discussions. And this is definitely a moving target where there's a question of collaboration, restrictions, but also sort of looking at the external environment, but also trying to look into it and see what we can do to improve ourselves. So this is a tremendously complex question that I think all 6 of you have contributed in illuminating quite a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.